name is Joe Hogue. I was born in Bonita Springs in 1954. My great-grandfather, L.B. Hogue, came to Bonita in 1911. He resided at Wiggins Pass in what was at one time Joe Wiggins' trading post. He just moved in there with his 5 boys, and they lived on Wiggins Island until about 1941. They were commercial fishermen, and that was the industry they were in. My great-grandfather, L.B. Hogue, actually came from a ranching family in Houston, Texas. When he was 17 years old, his older sister came to him and said that her husband had beat her up, and he went and hunted him up in a bar and shot him point blank. And he rode the rails to Florida because he told my dad at one point he wasn't swinging on a rope for shooting a man for beating up his sister. Well, he started out in Jacksonville, Florida, and he ventured down the coast. He got into the commercial fishing industry, and he got down to Treasure Island, and he was always afraid the feds were on top of him. I don't think they were, but he thought they were. So he traded a lot on Treasure Island for a 34-foot sailboat, and he brought his family to Bonita Springs just to get further south because he didn't think they would be able to find him there. He had a standing rule with his sons. He only had 1 daughter and 8 boys. He had a standing rule when he was at Wiggins Pass that if they married a woman, they would have to bring that woman to Wiggins Pass because he knew at some point the feds were coming, and he wanted his gun power. And in about 1924, he had a judge in his family who sent him a telegram and said, "I don't know if you believe this or not, but you did not kill Joe Acuff. You shot him point blank, but you did not kill him. And if you will come back to Texas, we will clear your name, and then we will not be hunting you anymore." And he did that. He came back to Wiggins Pass, and he told the boys that they could do whatever they wanted to at that point, and they ventured off the island one at a time, my grandfather, John Hogue, being the last. Well, that's what they did. That's what he came here as, a commercial fisherman, and all the boys ended up being commercial fishermen. And he was producing enough fish here that Bob Combs helped them build a fish house here in Bonita Springs because it was so hard to transport those fish to Naples at that time because didn't have any ice or anything, and they lost a lot of fish from spoiling. So they built a fish house here in Bonita Springs and right down by Wiggins. And my Uncle Bud actually ended up taking that fish house over later, but originally it was Bob Combs' fish house. At that time, most of the fishing they did then was for mullet, pompano, Spanish mackerel, and kingfish. That's mostly what they did when they were here. My grandfather ended up expanding, went on down to Naples, and then he started fishing much bigger boats. He ended up with the Bonita, which he had built in 1941. It was a 47-footer. Then he started catching a lot of kingfish and going offshore and catching a lot of red snapper. They were coming down the coast from what my great uncle Lewis said, and he came by Wiggins Pass, and there was a shack there that had been Joe Wiggins' trading post. It had been abandoned in about 1909. So he told my grandmother, he said, "We'll just pull in here and put up here." So they pulled in there and put up, and after about 6 months, one day a boat pulled in there where they were at, and there were some gentlemen on the boat. They were actually realtors from Naples, but my great-grandfather didn't realize that. So they asked him if he owned the place. He said, "Yes, I do." They said, "Do you have a deed?" He said, "Yes, I do." I said, "Well, can we see that deed?" He said, "That 30-30 leaned up against that tree right there." And they told him he couldn't do that, so he said, "Well, I'll buy the place." And they said, "Well, we don't want to buy it, but we'll lease it to you." So they leased it to him from what my dad says from 1912 to 1941 for $1 a year. That was the whole Barefoot Beach area where the condos are and everything, that whole island basically was his to reside on. They started fishing at Wiggins Pass in 1911. My great-grandfather fished there probably till the early 50s. He died in 55. He still was on a boat when he died. But my grandfather and the rest of the boys had ventured down to Naples. There was a bigger industry there for them, fishing for kingfish and stuff offshore. My great-grandfather was a little bit afraid of going offshore. He'd never been an offshore fisherman, so he wanted to stay in his territory. The bits that I have learned from my dad, because I wasn't around when this happened, was that each one of those people, the Weekses and the Johnsons and them, they fished mostly New Pass, Big Hickory, on up all the way up to Big Carlos. But they always had an agreement amongst them, from what I was told, that if there were a lot of fish there, they may say, y'all come on and get y'all some too. But they had to be invited. My great-grandfather, L.B. Hogue, in his mind, Wiggins Pass belonged to him. That was his turf, that was his farm, and that's where his livelihood was made. Well, when we got here, we were probably about the fourth major family that was here. When I looked him up in the 1910 census, he was actually at Fort Myers Beach. And the census for Bonita Springs at that time, which at that time was called Survey, there were four families here, the Lyles family, the McCormick family, the McSwain family, and then the Hogue family. From what I've gathered over the years, the next really influx of people came in the early 20s. My mother's family, the Stricklands, they were sawmillers in Georgia. They came here because there was a great deal of large virgin pine here. And my wife's family came here in 1926. So her grandfather could run the railroad bridge. He tended the railroad bridge so that they could lift the bridge up to let the boats underneath it. So I would say the next influx was probably in the early 20s. The first that I recall of the migrant workers coming here was in the late 60s, the early 70s. I recall that Ralph Saldivar came here at that time with his family from Texas. I think possibly Corpus Christi, but I'm not positive. I think he started out basically as a labor foreman because he could speak both American and Spanish. But then Ralph ended up being a farmer himself here and was quite successful in the tomato industry for a number of years. I don't remember any kind of rivalry at all. At that time, the farmers usually had camps, and they stayed at those camps. They came into town to go to the grocery store. I don't ever recall, I was a kid. I mean, I was 17, 18 years old, but I don't ever remember my parents being disturbed about them being here at all. My Uncle Bud, if I'm not mistaken, was the first man to ever roll a 700 series at Pine Lanes. I remember, I knew my Uncle Bud from the time I was 4 years old. He never, ever wore a pair of shoes. And I remember my dad bowled at Pine Lanes. The first night that I went to Pine Lanes and my Uncle Bud was bowling, I said to my dad, I've never seen Uncle Bud in a pair of shoes, period. He said, well, they won't let him bowl barefooted, so he had to wear a pair of bowling shoes. Well, my Uncle Bud and my Aunt Eva never had any children, but he decided midlife that he was going to leave the commercial fishing industry, and he started a fish camp there on the Bud Hogue Road. He rented boats out to tourists and stuff, but he also guided. There was a lot of people like to snook fish, and he guided snook fishermen. This particular video that we watched was of him and two gentlemen that used to play in Marty Robbins' band. They used to come here every year to fish with Bud for about a month there in July. Yes, my dad had to leave, go serve his country during the Korean conflict, And when he came back, the fishing industry was in much decline. He had 2 boys to feed, and he just couldn't make it any longer. So it broke his heart, but he told my grandfather, I've got to go get a different job. So he chose to be an electrician the rest of his life. But we loved the water. We stayed on the water. He still cast netted a lot. He bought me my first cast net when I was 11 years old. It's just in our blood. My son has picked up that same thing. I especially enjoy cast netting. I'm a wading cast netter, and when you're wading around these keys, which is the way we catch our fish, people catch them different ways, but this is the way we were taught to do it. You see so much stuff that you normally wouldn't see, and it's a beautiful world to me. It's a very calming. I do it a lot of times to relieve the stress of the week of working. And it's just the environment I love. We fish with rods some, but my grandfather, my great-grandfather always said, why would you want to catch fish one at a time on a hook when you can catch multiple fish in a net? Hogs don't use hooks, we use nets. And I guess it's sort of been inbred into us. Well, being a product of my father, he was a hunter, so I became a hunter. But most people today don't understand, when you got east of the cemetery, when my dad was 17 or 18 years old, you were in the woods. So it wasn't that far out of town for people to go hunt. I think those men were not sportsmen. Those men hunted to feed their families. This was more about providing food than it was today. Everybody wants to kill the big buck with the big set of horns. They were providing food for their family. It was an entirely different scenario. Actually, in Bonita Springs at that time, there weren't a lot of deer killed because there had been a screwworm epidemic at one point, and they had destroyed a lot of deer because they thought that they were spreading that. They also had a tick infestation. They killed a lot of deer off for that. My dad, when he was much younger, mostly hunted for turkey. And when I was a boy, he loved to quail hunt. He had a quail dog named Ginger, and he loved to hunt for bobwhite quail, most of which we got right there where the Bonita Springs water plant is today. My wife, Marisa Harvard, her grandparents came here around 1926. Her dad was born here in 1927, Cecil Harvard. He ended up working at Benson's Grocery, which was owned by his brother-in-law and his sister. He was the fire chief of Bonita Springs from, I think, 1948 to 1971. He was a great person, he really was. Most people probably won't believe this, but me and Marisa grew up 3 blocks apart. And I knew her when she was a young child. I mean, my mother-in-law has a picture of her 3rd birthday party, and I was at that 3rd birthday party. But actually, on the school bus going to school is where I really connected with her. And
which school are we talking about?
We were going to Cypress Lake. Me and Marisa have been married 42 years. We just celebrated our 42nd anniversary. We have 2 kids, Adam, who will be 38 this year, and Amber, who is 35. No, absolutely there wasn't. I don't know why, but Marisa was only 14 and a half years old when I started dating her, and I was maybe 17 years old. So, no, we are a first. I used to go to the Wonder Gardens because at one time I wouldn't say it was a fetish, but I caught several coral snakes. So I would take coral snakes in there to Lester Piper. Of course, Lester Piper knew me. My mother had swam in the gator tanks before there ever was a gator in there. So he knew the family. So that was our first connection. My daughter, Amber, ended up marrying one of the Piper boys herself. Growing up in the family I grew up in, my dad was a huge baseball player. He had been looked at by the St. Louis Cardinals at one point before Uncle Sam picked him up. So we loved baseball. We played baseball. But I had a boat from the time I was 11 years old forward. And this is a slight bit of a stretch, but I could go to Mound Key by boat almost before he would allow me to ride a bicycle across Old 41. I went to Bonita Springs Elementary School to the 6th grade, and then I ended up going to Cypress Lake, finished my schooling there. And then I became an electrician just like my dad. I always wanted to follow in his footsteps, so I became an electrician myself. Well, me and Ben have known each other since 1st grade, since we were 5 years old. And I ran around with Ben quite a bit during the year. Always every summer I played baseball. Ben worked for Nelson Marine. I mean, he was his dad's right arm from the time he was 7 years old forward. I grew up with several people here in Bonita, you know, the Sheffields and some of those people that have been here for a long time. Most of the people that I hung around with at that time probably came out of the fishing industry, the Gants and the Smiths, the Weekses, the Johnsons. I went to school with the Johnson girls, so I knew most of the people that were in that industry. The first time I ever told this story was after Ben's father died. And Lori Nelson had told one of the journalists, they were trying to find out some stories about Ben, and they said, call Joe Hogue. Him and Ben hung around together all the time. And I thought about the time that me and Ben had built a kite. We built it out of visqueen. I cannot remember what we used for the ribs, but this kite was about 6.5 feet long. Ben was always an engineer. He was about 6.5 feet long and about 4 foot wide. And we built this thing and we flew it out the window of his bedroom, which looked out over 41. And it wouldn't fly very high because it was so large, so it was only maybe 30 feet off the ground, but we thought it was very cool. And Ben, he's coming home and he's come down the road and he pulled in, come stomping up the stairs, and through the door open, he said, what in the world are you boys doing? We're flying a kite. He said, get that damn thing out of the sky right now. That's going to crash on some tourist's car, and they're going to own my hardware store. Well, me and Ben spent a great deal of time in the woods from the time we were probably 13 to about 15. His dad had a dredge pit out east of town. Actually ended up being where they ended up living later on. And we would drive out there in his Scout. He was about 13 years old. They would take us to the end of the pavement, and then we would go out there, and we would spend the weekend camping right around this lake. We could fish there. We could kill cottontails to eat, and we spent the weekend there a lot of times. We played a lot of scrimmage football over on the field over there by the schoolhouse. Unfortunately, we killed a lot of cottontails at night, and I spent a great deal of time on the water, spent a lot of time on the Imperial River. Me and a group of teenagers, girls and boys, skied. Most people probably wouldn't believe this today. We all learned how to ski behind a 12-foot boat with an 18-horse kicker on it. It started out with some of us guys. We started skiing on the river, and then some of the girls found out about it and they wanted to learn how to ski. So we would go down to Oak Creek to Wendy Cheatham's place. Her parents owned the Shangri-La. There was a dock right there on the creek, and a lot of Saturdays we'd go by there and pick the girls up. We would go to where Bonita Bay is now. There was a big pine that hung out over the water, and we would put everybody up on the shore there, and we would ski for 5, 6, 7 hours all day long. We had 3 boats at that time. Doug Block had a boat, Joy Lawhon had a boat, and I had a boat, and we would ski all day long. I was always shocked about that because, you know, everybody thought, you know, guys with this bunch of girls. But you know what? This was a bunch of kids that we were all good friends. I think back now, I don't know if I'd have ever let my daughter do it, but these guys let their daughters go with us. I think they trusted us, and we had a great camaraderie. We did. Linda Steger skied, Kathy Henning. They skied with us every weekend. It was a great time. It really was. Well, see, most of these girls came to our baseball games. You know, we grew up with them. We were all friends in school, and most of them had brothers that played baseball on the team, so they were at the baseball field every Saturday. The growth of Bonita Springs has been a double-edged sword for me because I am a contractor. I'm an electrical contractor. So I rely on these tourists to make my living, but I do at times miss the simplicity that we had at that time. My children were not allowed to be as free-spirited as I was. We had to protect them more than when I was growing up. Like I say, I could go all the way to Mound Key on a boat when I was 12 years old. I would go all the way up Oak Creek. I would get into the Imperial River, go all the way down the Imperial River, go through the auger hole, and cut right across the bay. And my mother used to get very disturbed when my dad, what if he breaks down? And he would say to her, Gene, he knows how to swim, and the commercial fishermen that are out there in that water know who he is, and he will be perfectly safe. I miss that. Probably the closest encounter I had, and it really wasn't an encounter, I did a lot of frogging down on the Immokalee Road when I was in my mid-30s with Bobby Sheffield. Bobby Sheffield was always crazy as a loon about certain things. We were frogging one night, and there was a whole group of gators in this canal, 14 to 16 inches long, and he got a hold of one and got him in the boat, and he was squeaking. I said, please put that damn thing overboard. You know that sow is going to hit the side of that boat with that tail and flip us both over, because we were only in a little wee 10-foot John boat. So that was a little bit disturbing to me. He thought it was quite funny. I didn't think it was funny at all. Well, I found in the latter years of the Pioneers, we first started going to Pioneer. First time that we ever went to a Pioneer week, Pioneer Day, was when my son was less than a year old, because they used to acknowledge the youngest and the oldest every year. And that particular year, he was the youngest. They went with us to Pioneer Days for 20 years, maybe 25 years. But then at some point, they both said, we go there every year, we see the same people every year. It's just not in our interest anymore. So I think that's sad in a way, but that's where it's headed. I think when Donald True and my mother-in-law and some of those are gone, I think it'll probably subside. Yes, I do, but I don't know any way to stop it at this point. I think it's went to the point now of not, not stopping. It breaks my heart a little bit. My oldest grandson, Splinter Cole, he says to me every once in a while, Papa, where are the animals going to live? Because with that Piper DNA in him, that's a thing that he thinks about. Every time they clear a piece of land, he'll say to me, Papa, where are the animals going to live now? I really don't ever have an answer for him. I really don't. It's something that I don't think we can stop at this point. It's went past that point now. There's too much money in development now. Fortunately, we do have some people that want to preserve some stuff, but animals are being encroached upon now, and now people are upset with animals and they want them taken out, alligators, cats, bears, because they're intruding upon us when in all reality, we intruded upon them.